everyone, welcome to this keynote session. Please take a seat. I have two things to say before we start with the keynote. One thing, please, after the keynote, please stick around for the ISMRC business meeting. It's not only numbers and important information. There will be awards, so I would assume fireworks and those kinds of things. So please do stick around after the keynote. Directly after the keynote, there will be the ISMRC business meeting. And tomorrow, it's important for you to know that the doors will be locked upstairs. Some of us, Mona and Julia, have already made this experience this afternoon. So the doors will be locked upstairs, but there will be someone standing there, probably myself, and then be guiding you, around the building to the back entrance over there. So no worries, just go to the same place you went to tomorrow, but then the doors will be locked and someone will get you from there to where the conference will be. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Katja Rakow. Katja Rakow is an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. She studied religious studies, anthropology, yes, Utrecht, anthropology and sociology at the Freie Universität Berlin and got her PhD in religious studies from Heidelberg University. She has worked on an impressively wide variety of topics, ranging from Tibetan Buddhism to Christian megachurches and Pentecostalism. What is very remarkable about Katja Rakow's work is how she manages to analyze the transformation processes in the religious field which are triggered by digital technologies without losing sight of its many continuities. And moreover, she combines the perspective on digital and hence, to some extent, immaterial tools with a focus on materiality as a dimension of the religious per se. In her talk today, she will focus on an extremely successful medium, one that has been around for quite a while and yet continues to thrive to this day, the medium of text. Please join me in welcoming from Utrecht, Katja Rakow.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction and for the invitation to give one of the two keynote lectures to this year's conference. It is a very great honor and also a pleasure to speak to such an esteemed audience of scholars. I really enjoyed the last couple of days listening to all your presentations and to have many really interesting conversations about your research. So in my lecture today, I want to approach the topic of metaphor and media from a material culture perspective. I am a scholar of religious studies, belonging to the tradition of material religion. So we might think immediately of how metaphors might materialize from or in religious texts and religious discourses. So the question then could be how such metaphors might materialize in religious art, for example. So one example, where do I have to point it? So that it communicates. Let's try it old school and use the keyboard. Now I need the other one. No, back. Yes, weird things happening. Maybe it's the Lord. Yes, this one. Okay, so one example could be the metaphor of the Good Shepherd and how it materializes in religious art. So here you can see a stained glass window. It is how a metaphor from a text might move into a different medium. In that case, the medium of an image. The question might be if the image might have existed before it went into text, but that is another story. Another example would be the metaphor of Jesus as light of the world. Incidentally, this is a stained glass window, so the moment that light falls through this image, he also becomes a source of light. But in an earlier work, I have demonstrated how a prominent US megachurch uses light, sound, and video to structure their worship service. In the first part of the service, characterized by bright lights and upbeat sound, the auditorium and stage are washed in bright lights. going to be? No. Okay, I washed in bright lights. You can see it here. The audience is well visible. They are clapping, singing, dancing along. So the interesting thing, and what you should keep in mind, is that everyone can see everyone in the act of what they are doing, why they are washed in these bright lights. The lighting scheme and the songs change in the second part of the worship service, which is characterized by muted lights and slow ballad-like songs. The lighting scheme usually is much darker, and the songs center on the saving work of Jesus Christ. So in this phase, the most significant light source Why is it not working? Okay, reagiert nicht. No, that is too far. Yeah. That the image or the photo, here you can see that it is much darker and the light source comes only from the stage. So what you can see is that the spill lights enlighten the first rows next to the stage. So the farther you move into the auditorium, the darker it becomes. It also means that the people farther in the auditorium are rather left in the dark, so to speak. So the only light source during this phase of the worship part are actually the images of Christ. Sometimes it's also images of cross on the stage. So Jesus becomes the source of light during this part of the worship service. And during these moments, they create a space for believers to become intimate with God. So Jesus literally becomes light. It is a carefully arranged choreography in which technology, space, and human bodies work together, attune believers to the dramaturgy of the worship service to work together. So both are examples of how religious metaphors are materialized. So the Good Shepherd is one example, but also how Jesus is the light of the world. It is one way how we can approach material metaphors. It is one way how we can think about material metaphors, but it is not the approach that I would like to pursue today. What I want to do today is inspired by a thought expressed by literary critic Katherine Hayles already more than 20 years ago. So, in her book Writing Machines, published in 2002, Katherine Hayles brings renewed attention to the materiality, in her case, of literary text. So what she criticizes, and that really resonates with me, not only for literary texts, is that texts have been treated as immaterial verbal constructions. So until then, early 2000s, the study of materiality had usually remained limited to very specialized fields. So here you could think of fields like bibliography, but also book production and manuscript culture. But with the advent of computational technologies into publishing and literary production, that of course changed. And the perception has shifted, and much more focus came to rest on the text itself as a material object. In Writing Machines, Hayles places the materiality of text itself front and center. So for her, it is not only the materiality of the textual artifact that matters, but also that of the bodies and the machines and all the context interacting or involved with a text. So this broader perspective on text allows her to introduce the concept, what she calls material metaphor. So that's the one I want to play today with. So traditionally, as you have, I think, heard several times during the conference, a metaphor is a verbal figure where meaning associated with one word is transferred to another, so this mapping across domains. In contrast to a material metaphor, in contrast to this verbal metaphor, a material metaphor involves the transfer of meaning from word to a physical object or a material apparatus. Or as she describes it, a material metaphor is a term that foregrounds the traffic between words and physical artifacts, unquote. So what Hayles is doing here is stepping away from the realm of pure semantics and grounding her thinking conceptually in the material world. For her, the book, as a physical artifact, as a technology, exemplifies her idea of a material metaphor. So the book to her is a material metaphor, something that allows for the traffic between words and a physical artifact. A material metaphor for Hayles structures the relation of word to world. It also means that if something in the physical composition of the material metaphor changes, it will impact ultimately the relation of word to world. So if something in the composition of the book changes, the relation of word to world will change. And what I find interesting in this idea is that her whole idea, how she conceptualizes book as this idea of a material metaphor, quite closely resonates with my idea of how I understand religious texts as material artifacts, as part of a larger network of human practices. So in the last couple of years, I have worked on what you could call a systematic materialization of the study of religious texts, or applying a material religion perspective to the study of religious texts and practices related to religious texts. And this is why I have chosen to focus on this very classical medium for my keynote lecture today, the book. Religious books and sacred texts more generally are of course important media. They can render the sacred tangible to religious practitioners, they communicate religious ideas, and they are actively involved in religious world-making. Our scholarly focus often rested on the semantic content and the hermeneutical analysis of texts. There's nothing wrong with that, but I would like to broaden the focus and take into account that there is a material side to texts. We have acknowledged the material side of books when we think about them as ritual implements, but there's also a material side to texts. The book is one of the most versatile technologies in human history, and book historians, scholars of typography or textual materiality tell us that any changes to the material form ultimately impact the production and the usage of books. So I think the move from scroll to codex, the move from manuscript to print, but also from print to digital, has shown that quite impressively. As a result, any changes also will have an impact on reading practices. And if they have an impact on reading practices, they will also make a difference in how we read and how we make meaning of what we read. So Hayles writes about literary texts and literary production. But thinking about the book as a technology, as a material artifact, an interface is also applicable to religious texts. So today I would like to use her idea of the book as a material metaphor as one of my sources of inspiration to think about religious texts as something that is situated in the physical world and encountered by embodied minds and embodied users. So I will first, let's try again. So I will first address the question, it seems simple, what is a book? And then I will explain my material approach to religious texts, users of texts, and practices related to text. I call it the triad of text, users, and practices. Why I call it that and what it is, I will explain shortly. Maybe as a side note, I did not start out as a scholar of texts. I'm also not a philologist. There are lots of philologists in the study of religion. I'm not one of them. I started out as a scholar doing fieldwork, first with Western Tibetan practitioners, so Western converts to Tibetan Buddhism. And then I did fieldwork with megachurches in the US and in Singapore. But what all my fieldwork sites had in common is that practitioners handled books and religious texts. So for me, texts become relevant in their embeddedness in practices. And this is why, for me, it is so important to combine these three elements. Not texts on their own, but in combination with people who do things with texts and the practices that are related to those texts. But first, let's start with the question, what is a book? So we usually might think of a book as a portable object made of bound pages. These pages are either blank sheets of paper or some other material, or they are covered with script or print or images. And usually they are sewn or glued together at one side. But they could also be loose sheets bundled together if we are in a different period or in a different area of the world. Book historians, however, handle a much broader view of what counts as a book. To them, the term book refers to a broad variety of written or printed texts on different materials. The materials could be clay tablets, so we heard of Cunean tablets this afternoon in one panel. Could also be papyrus, parchment, palm leaves. The book can come in various formats, may it be scrolls, plates, leaves, or pages. And the format does not need to resemble the codex format with which we are so familiar. Some book historians apply the term, quote, to virtually any piece of written or printed text that has been multiplied, distributed, or in some way made public, unquote. So that is a really very broad definition of what counts as a book. There are also very, very narrow definitions of what counts as a book. But the latter understanding of the term book indicates that not only a concrete object, but also a process, or all the processes that are involved in production, publication, and distribution. So a book then, in its very widest sense, is a human-made artifact, even a technology that involves human agency and interaction with a text at every stage of a book's making and usage. Book historian Leslie Hawsam suggests that we think of the book as a concept that references four things: a text, a material object, a cultural transaction, so think of production, distribution, and these things, but also an experience. I really like, especially the last part, to think of an experience. Think of an immersive reader who drowns in a text, kind of vanishes in a text when she reads. Her fourfold concepts indicates that books are embedded in a larger network of human activities and cultural practices. So Catherine Hayles reminds us, quote, the text must always be embodied to exist in this world. The materiality of those embodiments interact dynamically with linguistic, rhetorical, and literary practices to create the effects that we call literature, unquote. So Hayles talks about literary texts, but we can apply her considerations to religious texts and textual practices relating to scriptures, but also to religious texts more broadly. And I think the important takeaway here is that texts have a body and not only a speaking mind. So the book is a material technology, and it means that the physical properties and how we have used it in the past also shape how we use it today. So much of how we perceive and think of the book is quite print-centric. The page usually functions as a reading unit. Page numbers and a sequential binding indicate a linear order of reading. Hayles emphasizes, as I said earlier, that any alteration to the physical form of the book will impact everything else. So the context and the circumstances of interacting with the words and subsequently also the meaning will change. If the book as a material technology changes, the act of reading changes, and with it, how we make meaning. In turn, it will transform the metaphoric network that structures the relationship between words and the world. Hayles examined instances of human-machine interactions, She specifically explored books that required engagement with computer technologies to either generate or read their text. So here's an example. It's not from her book, it's a later example. I mean, the title of the book tells it already, Between Page and Screen. So you can't read the book without a computer and a camera embedded in the computer. So it is a book of poems embedded in these kind of QR codes, and you can only read these poems if you are connected to a computer and a camera. So she's kind of playing around with similar examples to kind of think about how text is generated and how kind of computer, text, book, and humans operating both in order to make the text or make the text accessible play together, this kind of network between text, bodies, machines, reading, creating, and making meaning. So with these examples, she challenged a more conventional understanding of books as separate, self-contained, and unchanging texts. Her work reflects a popular, not a popular, maybe also a popular, but what I meant is a particular moment in time. So digital technologies in publishing and literary production brought a renewed awareness for the materiality of texts. It brought also a renewed attention to the embodied engagement between production of texts and readers of texts. And it has challenged some long-held assumptions about texts, the production of texts, and reading practices. But it also might be worthwhile to rethink and how far those long-held assumptions also have colored how we think religious practitioners have approached texts in the past, how the book technology has changed over time, and how it has impacted text-related practices. So I think the most common example in history is, of course, the printing revolution and the impact the printing revolution in 15th century Europe had on Christian reading practices, especially on reading the Bible in vernacular languages. So Martin Luther played, of course, a crucial role even before translating the Bible scriptures into German, as he was the one who paved the way for the mass distribution of religious pamphlets to the common people. And it is exactly this mass distribution of religious pamphlets in vernacular languages that became a defining feature of the entwinement of book printing and the spread of the Protestant Reformation. So initially, as I think many of you know, Luther's disputes with the Catholic Church were published in Latin. He soon realized that there was a growing interest in these debates beyond clerical circles. So already 5 years after the public display of the 95 Theses, almost 90% of Luther's writings were published in German. 90%, and he was really one of the most prolific early Reformation writers. But it was not just the quantity of his output, it was also the format of his religious pamphlets that played a significant role in the successful spread of his ideas. So his texts were printed in the easy-to-produce and cheap-to-acquire quarto format. So just to give you an idea what a quarto looks like, it's not none of the Reformation prints, it's a print from England, but just so that you have an idea. The quarto format consisted of singular sheets folded twice to create 4 leaves, resulting in 8 pages. Contemporaries simply called such a pamphlet a libellus or Büchlein, a booklet or little book. They were easy to carry, but they were also easy to conceal. I mean, after all, it was heretic what was printed on them. The format became characteristic of many of the Reformation texts and greatly contributed to the widespread circulation of theological debates. In addition, the early Reformation pamphlets explicitly encouraged sharing the readings with the illiterate. The language used was formulated in a way to be easily read aloud. So Luther utilized commercial printers, he adopted the quarto format, he employed vernacular language. He skillfully catered to growing demands of a reading public and also a listening public who was illiterate. Mark Edwards, a historian of the Reformation, describes Luther as, quote, the first dominant publicist who led a major propaganda campaign and a mass movement, unquote. So his Catholic opponents stuck to Latin as the language of theological dispute and the church as a designated site for such debates. by eschewing German as a suitable language and the marketplace of cheap commercial printing as a suitable site to address Luther's challenges, the Catholic Church had a difficult time in successfully countering Luther's efforts in the early stages of the Reformation. And it was not until the second half of the 16th century that the Church was trying to oppose Reformation efforts more proactively. But by that time, vernacular Protestant versions of Christianity had taken a hold in several European countries. In these strongholds the Reformation, the language of faith had been irrevocably changed. So we could describe Luther and other reformers as early adopters of a new technology, which had a huge impact on the formation of a new strand of Christianity and, of course, of wider cultural practices. If we think about this new technology that affects the book as a material metaphor, then it becomes a story about a specific media format, new materials, new practices, the use of vernacular language for writing and reading. It is a story about specific reading practices and specific audiences. It is a story about a nascent printing industry and a reading public. The move from manuscript to print implies a change of the physical artifact of the book. And to invoke Catherine Hayler's terminology, it implied a change in the material metaphor, which metaphorically and materially changed the relation of word to world. So for Hayles, it is not just the materiality of the textual artifact that is relevant, but that of bodies, machines, and contexts interacting or involved with text. And I have a similar approach when I think about texts. I call it the triad of religious texts, users, and textual practices. I call it a triad because it is a set of three related things. And to me, it does not make sense to look at texts or users or textual practices separately. It only makes sense to look at all three in conjunction with each other, which will become clear, hopefully, when I will now try to artificially separate each element to introduce it to you. So what kind of text do I consider relevant? In general, every text, oral, written, printed, displayed, does not matter as long as it is part of or engaged in religious practices. I include not just the authoritative texts of a religious tradition, so scriptures, for example, but all kinds of religious texts, popular works, all genres, all media formats, as long as they transmit religious discourses or ideas or are engaged in religious contexts. Each medium mediates text, of course, in specific ways, and that is why it is crucial to account for the medium and the materiality of texts and how these and their affordances impact what users do with texts and how they make sense of texts in their practices. But for this purpose, I will limit myself to books. A text is, of course, always more than its content. The content needs to be mediated via a material medium, may that be paper and ink or pixels on a screen. Earlier, I mentioned the idea that texts have a body and not only a speaking mind. So there's always a material side to text. There's the book, the page, the layout, the words, the letters. Linguist Hartmut Stöckel has described typography as, quote, the body and dress of a text. I really like this metaphor. According to Margaret Jane Kidney, a professor of English, quote, readers construct meaning not just by reading a page, but by looking at a page, unquote. And Laurie McGuire, a professor of textual studies, speaks of the persuasive effects of layout. So she argues that, quote, mise-en-page influences readers in the same way that rhetoric influences readers, unquote. So what these researchers argue is that typographic conventions and page layout are not just inconsequential embellishments, but structure and guide the reading process. So if we take this into account, these elements might hugely contribute to the persuasiveness of religious text, and that might give us pause if we think about why texts might be so persuasive. The example of the Red Letter Bible with which some of you might be familiar, illustrates how the materiality of text influences engagement with it. So the convention of using red ink to mark the words attributed to Jesus goes back to Louis Klopsch. You see him on the left side. He was a Christian journalist and publisher in the late 19th century. And in line with his evangelical convictions, Klopsch wanted to emphasize the importance of Jesus' message. Using red ink to mark the words of Jesus translated his intent into a visual form. Verses printed in red helped to distinguish Christ's word from the surrounding text set in black. Text marked in red, so-called rubrics, is of course nothing new. It's a classical paratextual feature that helps to structure text. It has been used in medieval manuscripts or in liturgical texts for many ages. Klopsch's typographical innovation of the biblical text quickly became popular, and red letter editions are still in print today. So what does his invention do? To a reader familiar with the typographical convention, biblical text printed in red signals that Jesus is speaking. The reader can arrive at that conclusion solely by visual cues before having read any of the printed words on the page. So the example shows that what is relevant is not only what is written on a page, but also how it is written in material terms. A text or book becomes only relevant in the context of its use. That implies someone doing something with a text. That brings me to the second element of my triad, the users. I speak of users of text rather than readers. Of course, users can be readers, but I do prefer the term users to readers. Employing the term users prevents us from immediately assigning them the primary role of readers, while they might be doing very different things with text. They might venerate or worship a text, recite or perform a text. They might copy or even bury a text. So reading is only among the many uses a text can be put to. Users are, of course, bodied agents who interact with a text through their senses. And how they make sense of their experiences is impacted by their embodied experience. And that does not only apply to ritually doing something with a text, but also to reading a text. So even a reader is still an embodied user of a material text. I have a rather visceral example to kind of give you the embodied dimension of accessing a text. So the story of the Japanese Buddhist monk Miura can serve as an illustration that there is a material dimension to accessing physical text. The story is recounted in Charlotte Eubank's work Miracles of Book and Body. It seemed that monk Miura thought at some point that a shaved head, the signal of monkhood in Buddhism, was not a reliable enough sign of a person's devotion or true intentions. So that is why he decided that as a sign of his sincerity, he would cut off his right ear. According to his disciple Kikai, the logic behind this rather drastic measure was as follows. So he thought if he plucked out an eye, he would grieve over not being able to see the scriptures. If he would cut off his nose, then snot would dribble on the scriptures. If he would sever his hand, he would not be able to form the mudras, and he would of course be in agony over not being able to form the mudras. But if he cut off an ear, he would still be able to hear. Very logical. So the monk's decision regarding which part of his body to mutilate was based on the material reality of his physical access to the sutras. So he considered whether he still would be capable of seeing, holding, or hearing the sutras. He considered if he still could perform the necessary actions, such as keeping the sutras free from pollution or forming the mudras. The monk's deliberations show that he is very aware of his body and the fact that his body interacts with the sutras. It is his body that enables him to access and handle the sutras. It is not simply a question of content that miraculously jumps into his mind, but indeed a question of embodied engagement with a material artifact. I include producers and distributors into the category of users. And that could be translators, copyists, illustrators, rubricators, people with limited or no literate knowledge at all. But they are, of course, important for the existence of texts and the circulation of texts. Let me give you another example to illustrate the idea of an embodied author and translator and embodied readers. So the Orchard of Sion, or Sion, is a late medieval English translation of the dialogues of Catherine of Siena. Here I'm relying on the work of Heather Blood. The Orchard starts with a prologue, and the prologue only exists in the English translation of the work. So the prologue by the translator is, for his prospective readers, a group of nuns. In the prologue, the translator draws a comparison between the text and an orchard. That's where the title comes from, while likening the chapters in the text to the pathways within the orchard. He encourages the nuns to savor the chapters in the order that suits them best. In other words, he urges them to read the chapters in a non-linear manner. And to achieve that goal, the prologue uses metaphors related to an orchard, which invoke notions of place, but also mobility and consumption. The text is portrayed as a physical space akin to an orchard where the reader can freely move and choose different pathways. Reading is likened to a leisurely walk in the garden where chapters are to be selected without a specific order. The chapters are described by the translator as various herbs and fruits that are either sweet or bitter, and they can be consumed through reading. This act of reading is metaphorically connected to bodily movements and effects, and to a form of spiritual consumption and nourishment that is linked to spiritual progression. So this conveys the idea that reading the text in a non-linear way can lead to significant and swift spiritual growth. We can think of the translator of the Orchard as an embodied author penning the prologue with his prospective readers, the audience of nuns, in mind. The metaphors of walking through the garden and experiencing the sights and smells and tastes portray, of course, bodily activities. Both the author and of the prologue, as well as the anticipated readers, can easily relate to these bodily sensations and activities. The translator's approach suggests that his audience might not have been familiar with nonlinear reading practices, and this is why he provided chapter divisions and guidance on how to navigate them. The orchard metaphor here serves as both reading instruction and interpretative device, relying on the embodied experience of the anticipated readers. So in her book, Participatory Reading, Heather Blood highlights that authors of the period were aware of the importance of bodily experiences to the work of reading. And her analysis of works from the period shows that authors engaged with or anticipated their readers quite actively, and that they used this kind of metaphorical language to move their readers through architectural spaces and landscapes like the orchard in order to create something that you could describe as an immersive reading experience. It is impossible to think about the embodied user without relating the user to the text as a material artifact with which they engage, which brings me to the last part of the triad, the textual practices. I call textual practices every kind of practice that engages religious texts in the context of religion. And it means that I do not limit my understanding of these practices to reading or interpreting. It includes ritual manipulation or veneration of texts, but also the practices often labeled as folkloristic, magical, or heretic, but also the practices of production and distribution of religious texts. I also refer to the entire spectrum of text-related practices as practicing texts. The phrase practicing text emphasizes that human agents are not just passive recipients of textual contents. They actively engage books and texts in many ways. The phrase also avoids isolating the material object, the text, from its actual bodily engagement by religious practitioners. It allows us to think of the text in relation to its users and their users of the text. And finally, the phrase practicing text helps us to sidestep the otherwise immediate association of seeing reading as the primary way to engage with text, when it is just one among the many ways of practicing text. So practices for me create the material link between the material text and the embodied user, and that is from a practice theory perspective. So where practices are materially mediated nexuses of activity that kind of are anchored in human bodies and human-made artifacts. So Fabio, returning once more to a Buddhist example, Fabio Rambelli and Daniel Feitlinger differentiate between hermeneutical and cultic practices with regards to Buddhist scriptures. And the Mahayana Buddhist cult of the book is an often cited example when it comes to non-hermeneutical uses of religious text or cultic uses of religious texts. In Mahayana Buddhism, sutras advocate their own veneration as sacred objects, and they promise rewards to those who do so. It explains why we find widespread practices where sutra manuscripts are worshipped and regarded as powerful protective devices. And the sutras also often demand their own transcription. This explains why we find so many copying projects where sutras are copied and not to be read in the first place, but to be worshipped or offered. So one example of a non-hermeneutic practice is this rotating sutra shelf from Japan. So it's full of sutra scriptures, not meant to be read, but the merit comes from rotating the shelf. So the practitioner is not even in contact with the scriptures itself, but only with a shelf by rotating them. But that already generates merit. So this is one example of non-hermeneutical practices of engaging with sutras. But I have a different example where the boundary between hermeneutical and non-hermeneutical practices is not as clear-cut. That is the example of the so-called jeweled pagoda mandalas from Japanese Buddhism. These are images made out of text. And although the written text of the sutra is used, the text is not meant to be read, but to be looked at and venerated. The arrangement makes it almost impossible to follow the natural flow of the text. And Fabio Rambelli puts it very succinctly when he states that the, quote, signifying units of written text become non-signifying elements of visual figuration, unquote. Hallie O'Neill, who studied several of those mandalas, concludes that through diagramming the text as a pagoda, quote, the sutra text relinquishes its discursive properties, unquote. Content here is mediated through graphic visualizations, and you see little pictures surrounding the pagoda. These are narrative vignettes. So you see, the thing is, the content of the sutra is still mediated, it's still told. There is a story here, but it's not the text, it's images that tell the story. So there's still something hermeneutical, and there are still signs that tell a story. So I'm not quite sure if this is a good example for non-hermeneutical practices, because hermeneutical and non-hermeneutical practices intersect even in this kind of veneration of sutra texts. So, yeah, I would say the difference between hermeneutical and non-hermeneutical practices is one way to categorize textual practices, and in a discipline that has for a long time focused on the content of religious texts, it was maybe important to point out that there are practices that are not interested in the content of scriptures, but it might muddy the water a bit if we kind of too strictly put these two things apart. To separate hermeneutical and non-hermeneutical practices might really hinder us to fully grasp how materiality, form, content, practices, context, and users dynamically interact in religious settings. So as mentioned earlier, and I'm close to the end, so bear with me. And as mentioned earlier, sutras demand their own veneration and reproduction. In Mahayana Buddhism, a sutra is a site of living presence, an embodiment of the Buddha and his teaching. So as a site of living presence, it shapes what people can do with a sutra and how they interact with a sutra. So this is my last example. Charlotte Eubanks brings our attention to the bodily dimension of sutra worship. She shows that different kinds of interacting with the sutra can be conceptualized actually as two bodies interacting with each other. So we had the example of monk Mio earlier. So it's the human body and the sutra as a body of living presence. So hearing, but also seeing, holding, copying, reading, memorizing a sutra, all are bodily activities that bring the practitioner into sustained contact with Buddhist scriptures. The body and its actions become a pathway and inscribe the sutra into the body. So Eubanks argues that the practitioners reading, reciting, copying a sutra participated in what she calls a physical symbiotic relationship with the scriptures that they reproduced. So it is this symbiosis that has the power to transform the practitioners and thereby propel them towards enlightenment. And in her book, she examines sutras but also setsuvas. These are miracle stories, and these stories focus on people who have copied or recited endlessly these sutras and what happens to them. And these stories are really quite interesting because some of these stories really tell the story how the sutra is inscribed deep into the body, deep into the bones. So there are stories where people, even after their death, the skulls of them still chant the sutra, or where we have sutras still inscribed on the bleached bones. So of course there are miracle stories, right? But they tell the story that the sutra transformed the body of the practitioner through the sustained context. So like our understanding of the book, the Mahayana Sutra functions as a material metaphor for Buddhist practitioners. As a ritual and devotional device, sutras structure their relationship of word to world, or as Paul Harrison described Mahayana Sutras as possessing, quote, a vitality that is descriptive and constitutive of a total world, a world which obeys different laws from the one we normally inhabit, but into which we can enter, unquote. So I come to my concluding remarks. Drawing from Catherine Hayles' concept of the book as a material metaphor, I emphasize that the texts possess a physical existence beyond mere intellectual content. Yeah, Birgit, you will know the picture because you sent it to me. Friedrich Schiller's quote displayed at the walls of the Central Library in Leipzig captures part of this notion. It reads, quote, "Body and voice let us lend to silent thought. Thought century streams, it is carried through century streams, it is carried by the speaking page," unquote. So it acknowledges the need for the body and voice of letters to preserve thoughts for posterity. Letters and book pages serve as a material media, carrying thoughts across generations and making them accessible to embodied readers. So Schiller, sorry, I'm German, I had to end with a German quote. Schiller's metaphors of the body and voice of letters and the speaking page remind us of the embodied agents involved in producing and receiving material texts. They emphasize the significance of texts existing in a tangible form and the importance of their physical characteristics. So these bodily and, in the end, material metaphors serve as a vital reminder for the material qualities of texts. However, the complete picture emerges when we consider the user's role and their practices in relation to texts. I captured this interrelation in the triad of texts, users, and practices. The triad for me underscores the physicality of texts, the embodied users, and the material link formed between the two elements through practices within the physical world. So meaning is not simply captured on the page, but something constructed or emerging in the in-betweenness of the three elements of the triad. The study of religious texts and their contents, so I think also of religious metaphors, has much to gain from a material grounding that takes the interrelation of religious texts, their users, and related practices into account. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Katja. We started a bit late, so there's still some time for questions or comments for Katja. Who wants to start?